I think returning to a period that I remember when I first went to China in the early 1970s, when Mao Zedong was still alive, and there was a very hostile relationship. Who ended engagement? And I have to say here, I don't think it was the United States that ended it. It ended before Trump. And it ended because I think fundamentally, when Xi Jinping came to power in 2012 and 13, he could not quite imagine that the United States was not sort of hostile. And that expression in Chinese, di dui shi li, hostile foreign force, is deep, deep, deep in him, in the party. And it means it's almost impossible to overcome that, to find some common ground. So I think China's victim culture, 100 years of humiliation, the Yazhou Bingfu, the sick man of Asia, it was humiliating. And the Western powers were grabbing pieces of China, Hong Kong, Macau, etc. But now China is not a victim.
Right.
China is successful.
Very successful.
Why not enjoy that success?
That's right.
So Mahbubani's idea, I think he thinks, well, China's strong trade partner and the U.S. is too full of itself. And under Trump, I more or less agree with him. But, China's not the answer. China's not a viable proposition in the long run because there are too many contradictions and too much of it is dependent on one man. And that one man cannot even appoint a successor, a Jiebanren, because as soon as he does, he knows he's finished. He's a lame duck. Now we're at the point where what matters is choke points. What choke points does the U.S. have to choke China? Microchips, its market power. And what does China have? It has rare earth critical minerals. It has solar panels, polysilicon. So we're at this stage where the two powers who should be collaborating and once were cooperating, now are trying to figure out how to strangle each other, prevent each other from progressing, because we fundamentally view each other as a threat.
Thank you, Professor Schell, for taking your time to Can News interview. The recent development in U.S.-China relationship have become increasingly difficult to understand. President Trump has repeatedly used tariff as a political weapon. Yet, they appear to have very limited effect. Before his meeting in South Korea, he even revives the idea of a G2. How do you interpret the current state of this relationship?
I think we have entered a period of kind of mutual retaliation. We came out of a period that lasted several decades, which we know as engagement, where people were more or less on both sides of the U.S.-China divide trying to cooperate. We are now in a period where I think each side is not only competing with the other side, but trying to prevent the other side from being able to succeed either militarily, through trade, technologically, in many, many different ways. We are, in a certain sense, I think, returning to a period that I remember when I first went to China in the early 1970s, when Mao Zedong was still alive, and there was a very hostile relationship. And the presumption on both sides was that it was not friendly.
Right.
So we've kind of returned, I'm afraid, to a period where we're in a spiral downward of greater and greater, a sense that both China and the U.S. do not sort of mean well to the other. They do not mean to try to assist or help or collaborate with the other, but to compete and possibly enter even a more adversarial relationship.
Wow. Sounds serious.
Yes.
Right. So do you believe President Trump has a coherent strategy for competing with China and could be winning?
It's a very good question, and gets to the heart of the matter.
Right.
I think actually President Trump is a little bit like Mao Zedong. And you will remember that one of the things, one of the sources of Mao's power was that he made everybody uncertain about what he was going to do next.
That's right. Right.
And you remember he most sort of respected Sun Wukong, from Xi and what was his maxim? His maxim was, 大闹天宫, make great disorder under heaven. And there was one other slogan that Mao made popular during the Cultural Revolution. And you may recall it. It was 世界大乱, 形势大好. The world is in great disorder. Excellent situation. And this is very much what Donald Trump is like. I think he doesn't have a theoretical basis for it, as Chairman Mao did. Chairman Mao wrote his theory of contradictions. He had his theories on Leninism, imperialism, and antagonistic relationships, et cetera, et cetera. Trump is more like an animal, but he has a kind of an instinctual sense that if he can keep everybody off balance by being very unpredictable, being on this side one moment, on that side the next, he will be able to derive an immense power over people because everybody will be confused and nobody quite knows how to respond. And so in this sense, I think we in the United States now are experiencing something of our own cultural revolution. Not exactly the same, to be sure, but a leader who is really autocratic, is very unpredictable, is very intolerant, and has got everybody confused, frightened, scared. You can either be in opposition or you can run along behind him and just sort of follow him like the Chinese expression, 走狗, a running dog. Mm-hmm. And this is a rather strange thing for Americans to be in, and it casts the U.S.-China relationship into a very uncertain predicament.
So we'll see this one in the next 4 years or 3 years, right?
Well,
or what do you think the future president will have a different strategy, or what's your predict?
Well, we'll have to wait and see. Donald Trump has 3 more years.
Right.
So at least we have to wait that out. Mm-hmm. It's very hard to predict. Just as if someone had asked a Chinese person in 1967 to predict what would happen in the Cultural Revolution, what would you say?
Right.
You wouldn't know.
Right. Wow, that's a horrible
So I think
picture.
we are in a period where, as I said, Trump wants to sort of upset everything. And in an almost animal way, he understands that he derives a great measure of power from that because it makes people uncertain about how to respond. It's not a rational world. It's a fundamentally irrational world, and that's why I think it's really important now that we have a better understanding of the leaders themselves. We are in a period, globally speaking, not just in China and the U.S., but where the big leader,
It's leader culture.
leader culture. We remember we used to have Mao Zedong as the 伟大的, 舵手, the great helmsman, the great leader. We're back in a great leader culture. And this means it's not so much ideology, national interest, religion, economics that drive things. It's the nature of the leader himself. Where did he come from? What does he want? Is he insecure? Is he feel strong? Is he arrogant? All of these things, I think, are what we are now confronting, and it's quite a new world from the old world which we came out of, which was the Cold War, then engagement. Now we're back in whatever you want to call it. It's hard to know what name to put on it.
Yeah, it's a Big Brother's era.
Yes, I think you could say it's an era of autocracy. It's an era where democracy is imperiled. It's an era of very transactional era where power is important.
Right.
How you manipulate people is important,
Yeah.
not principles or most of these leaders do not have much of a moral compass on.
And is the current round of the U.S.-China relationship fundamentally structured? Or do you see the possibility that it could eventually evolve into a new phase of competitive coexistence or competition within cooperation?
I mean, everybody dreams of more cooperation because that is what engagement was basically, it was collaboration and cooperation. Not complete, to be sure. There were still tensions and disagreements. And after all, the U.S. and China both had very different political systems and still do. So is cooperation a possibility in the future? I think in the long run, yes. In the short run, I doubt it. I frankly don't think, as I look at the Chinese leadership under Xi Jinping, that he is a man comfortable with collaboration, particularly with someone like Donald Trump, who's so unpredictable, but also with a democratic world, whether it's Europe, America, Australia, Japan, Korea. I think deep in his soul, Xi Jinping understands that there is some fundamental antagonistic contradiction between Marxism, Leninism, the dictatorship of the proletariat, Chinese autocracy, and the democracies around him, however imperfect they may be. And I think that means that it's going to be very, very, very difficult for us to jump back over that wall and find a way, as Nixon and Kissinger did in 1972, to begin to try to find some new basis to come together and sort of resolve the Cold War question. I don't think either leader in America or China is up to that task. So I'm rather pessimistic about the future. And then we have questions like Taiwan. So if China makes some move to, quote, liberate Taiwan, that will be the equivalent of what Putin did in the Ukraine, and we will, in effect, then have a world war. Because we'll have a big war in Asia, we'll have a big war in Europe. So I think it's this idea of that Xi Jinping has a rejuvenation. Yes, I understand every country wants to be great, but it's the quality of the greatness that a leader seeks, whether it's a greatness to be able to have hegemony over others or economic greatness, which actually China has attained. It's quite extraordinary. But what I fear is that we may find that China's immense success is destroyed by bad leadership. And what I mean by bad leadership is making decisions to do things which Xi Jinping may feel he's obliged to do, like take Taiwan or have some military conflict off the Philippines, over the South China Sea, over islands that China claims. And then, of course, the entire Chinese miracle, economic miracle, would be threatened.
Yeah,
And it would be an immense tragedy for China and the world.
Totally not benefits to the China.
No, so you have to ask yourself, if this is not a benefit to China, why would it happen?
Right.
Well, it happens not because the leaders are making rational assessments of national interests, what's good for the people of my country and the world. It's because they have some other agenda that they, as leaders, as people, feel they need to attain. And this is the danger of big leaders, of autocratic leaders, is they can act out their own sort of character flaws on their countries and their world. And this is exactly what Mao Zedong did. I mean, China had 30 incredibly painful years because one man, Mao Zedong, you had a choice. You followed him, or you ended up in Laogai or a prison camp or someplace.
Miserable.
So I think that when we have such leaders, and now both the United States and China have leaders that are very unpredictable and very ambitious, very erratic, very insecure, we have a very, very sort of ominous future ahead of us.
So what's the agenda, you think, for those kind of big leaders?
I think the agenda for all of these leaders, whether it's Kim Jong-un, Vladimir Putin, Viktor Orban, Xi Jinping, Donald Trump, and there are many, many others, is to become great. And in the case of Russia and China, I think it's a sense of greatness lost, that once their countries were great, the Soviet Union, the Tsar, Catherine the Great, and China, the Ming Qing dynasty. And I think there is this narrative of victimization, that China has been humiliated, victimized. And Russia feels that too.
Yeah.
And Putin feels he had his empire taken away from him. And so did China. So when the Communist Party came to power in 1949, they didn't choose to restore the empire of the Ming dynasty, which was very small, just central China. They chose to reinstate the empire of the Qing dynasty, which would be Hong Kong, Tibet, Xinjiang, Mongolia, Manchuria, and even parts of Russia that they'd had to give away. So it was a very expansive notion of a restoration of empire. So I think Trump, too, remember what's MEGA, Make America Great Again. It's this sense that all of these leaders have that their country is not as great as it should be, which I think fundamentally derives also from their own personal sense. They are not as great as they should be.
Mm-hmm.
And remember Xi Jinping's past. I mean, his father in 1962, for the second time, was purged. He was a Li Shifan Geming Fenzi, a historical counter-revolutionary. And imagine being a young boy. First of all, your father isn't home. Second of all, your mother is having to criticize her husband because he's a counter-revolutionary, even criticizing Xi Jinping. Everybody's criticizing everybody for no reason except that the party insists on it. And imagine this young kid, 14, 15, 16 years old, growing up. Where is his sense of sort of parental affection, parental cultivation. He's on his own. And you have to imagine this influenced him. You also have to remember Trump, too, grew up with a father who was very abusive. And so both of these men, I think, do have a kind of a sense of insufficiency, insecurity. Interestingly, Mao Zedong also had such a family. Mao Zedong's father was a tyrant. Mao Zedong told Edgar Snow this, beat him. Mao Zedong ran away from home many times as a young man. And I think this instilled within him a sense that, and he said to Edgar Snow in 1936, he said, the only way I survived was I learned that I had to stand up to my father. So I mention these things because they're not conventional political sort of questions that we normally talk about, or economic questions or religious questions, but they're questions about how human beings come to be who they are. And all leaders are human beings.
Right.
And all leaders have character formation in their early years. And I think it's really interesting to look at that now because we're in this period where people like Donald Trump are just doing whatever they want. And it isn't because they sit down with their National Security Council and say, okay, what is in the best interest of America or the world or whatever. No. It's just, how do I feel today? Do I like this guy? Do I not like this guy? So Mao Zedong locked up Liu Shaoqi. He died in prison. I mean, think of all the people Mao Zedong destroyed. Why? I don't think anyone can answer the question except to say he was paranoid, fearful, and insecure.
That's true. So it looks like we're back to the power politic era.
Well, this is why systems are so important,
Right.
because if you don't have political systems with constitutions and laws that restrain leaders, leaders can do whatever they want. And if they're leaders that are not comfortable with themselves, well-educated, disciplined, thoughtful, humane, they do terrible things.
Right.
Nothing new here under history. We've seen thousands of times this has happened.
Yeah.
We've seen Hitler, we've seen Mussolini, Franco, Salazar, Stalin. This is not new.
In your dialogue, you have a debate with Kishu Mahbubani. He argued that the world must recognize China's rise as a major global power. Others, however, believe that regardless of China's political system, the United States will always seek to counter it. That's called society's trap. So in which a dominant power and a rising power inevitably clash. So do you agree with this assessment?
Not necessarily. I don't think it is an axiom written in the heavens that a rising power and a waning power have to go to war. And I think this Thucydides' Trap that Graham Allison wrote was an interesting book. But I think Graham Allison does not understand China. Sparta and Athens are not China. And China has its own version of why it feels antagonism towards America and the West that Athens and Sparta did not have. So I think it is sometimes probable that a rising power and a declining power will go to war, but it's not inevitable. And that was exactly what engagement was supposed to prevent. That somehow we could have a rising power, China, ascendant power, the United States, with very different political systems, but that somehow, if we just bit by bit by bit tried to collaborate, cooperate, trade, shared academic experiences, cultural experiences, maybe we could diminish the differences enough to get along.
That's old order, which is tearing down right now.
Yes, we tried.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we tried.
Nine American presidential administrations supported that.
Mm-hmm.
And interestingly enough, after 1989, which was you remember the Beijing massacre in Tiananmen Square, where we don't know how many thousands were killed or wounded.
I was a student at that time.
You were a student, yeah, by the People's Liberation Army. Afterwards, secretly, President Bush, the senior, sent his national security advisor, Brent Scowcroft, to China. Did not even tell the American ambassador to Beijing, James Lilly. He sent him to see Deng Xiaoping, to say to Deng Xiaoping, please, 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 we are friends. This is a terrible thing that has happened, but let's not break off what we've built up together. And Deng Xiaoping, who was a very smart man, and I think in many ways a very honorable man, challenged him, was very angry, and said, you caused this. This is your doing. The West created this disturbance, these demonstrations. You with your peaceful evolution, trying to incite our young people to oppose the Communist Party, and he couldn't accept the fact that Bush had sent this man over to say, please, let's keep engagement going. Now, ultimately, it did start up again to some degree under Jiang Zemin, but it was an expression, I think, of the dedication that the American presidents, 9 of them, all made to try to get along. So why did it end? That's the question we all have to answer. Who ended engagement? And I have to say here, I don't think it was the United States that ended it. It ended before Trump. And it ended because I think fundamentally, when Xi Jinping came to power in 2012 and 13, he could not quite imagine that the United States was not sort of hostile. And that expression in Chinese, di dui shi li, hostile foreign force, is deep, deep, deep in him, in the party, and it means it's almost impossible to overcome that, to find some common ground.
It looks like it's a very different worldview. One is engagement. Another one is always think his victim.
Yeah. So I think China's victim culture, 100 years of humiliation, it's very strange. I understand it historically because China did have some, back in 100 years ago, China was, what was it, the Yazhou Bingfu, the sick man of Asia. It was humiliating, and the Western powers were grabbing pieces of China, Hong Kong, Macau, etc. But now China is not a victim.
Right.
China is successful.
Very successful. Mm.
Why not enjoy that success?
That's right.
Why make it antagonistic? I mean, China has accomplished an absolute, the thing that it dreamed of for years, and now it's here, but it's all being put at risk.
Right. So that's what you called, we're talking about the status of the engagement policy toward China. And so the West, so this kind of engagement from China's view, they are kind of, they think this engagement policy will lead, which lead to the economy development, also lead to the political liberalization, which, but where we're talking about this kind of diverge from this expectation. So was U.S. engagement, including support for China's WTO accession, a mistake? What might have happened had engagement not occurred, or China's WTO entry being conditioned differently, in your view?
Well, I think when the United States supported China's admission into the WTO, it was part of the whole idea of engagement. Embrace China, include China, make China part of the global order as it existed. And yes, China did get rich becoming part of it.
Right.
But I think what happened was that China, when Deng Xiaoping arrived in 1978, Mao Zedong had died in 1976, and then Deng Xiaoping, who'd been purged, came back, and he started this extraordinary sort of reform program, 改革开放, reform and opening. But remember, one thing he did in 1979, he said, there are 4 basic principles.
Right.
And people didn't pay a lot of attention to it. They were so excited by all the changes in reform and opening. But what were the 4 basic principles? They all had to do with the party, the Chinese Communist Party.
The power.
That it would stay, it was the center, you couldn't forget about it, you had to be loyal to it. And most people just thought, oh, he has to say that, it's old sort of language from the past. But actually, I think Deng was a Leninist. So China kept the old system intact that it had borrowed from Stalin in the early 1950s, even as it was reforming. The problem was that ultimately reform, if it kept going, was going to change that system.
Yeah.
And everybody kind of knew that, but as long as it hadn't reached that final state, they weren't going to say anything. But then it began to, in 1989, during the Tiananmen Square demonstrations, people began to see that reform and opening probably would end up being the end of the Chinese Communist Party. And Deng Xiaoping himself, despite all his intelligence and his willingness to see China become more open, more reformed, more international, even he couldn't take it because he couldn't imagine China without the Chinese Communist Party. So the presumption has always been that the party, as Xi Jinping says, the party's interests come first. And you cannot have reform going on and on and on because ultimately it collides with maybe people don't want to have one party. They want to have 2 or 3 parties. So that was the problem. And so the party is not wrong when it looks at America and says that America would like to change us or Europe would like to see us become more democratic. They're right about that. We would. Who wouldn't? Except the Chinese Communist Party. And so that is a challenge and that is a threat. And that means ultimately reform cannot continue. Ultimately, internationalization cannot continue because China will be influenced by what in Chinese is 和平演变, peaceful evolution. If we can't overthrow the Chinese Communist Party militarily, we'll do it quietly with education, with foundations, with cultural exchanges, with propaganda, with Radio Free Asia, et cetera, et cetera. So there was a contradiction that was fundamental in the whole notion of engagement, that you had 2 systems that were antagonistic and in opposition. And if you couldn't resolve that fundamental contradiction. Engagement ultimately was going to hit a wall, and it did.
Depend if they want to solve this one voluntarily.
If China wants to solve, well, I'm afraid if China wants to solve it voluntarily, they'd have to say, well, let's see where Heping Yanbian goes. If the people choose one-party system and free and open elections, okay.
It's like as in Singapore.
Like in Singapore, they choose something else, okay. But that's not what Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party is willing to see happen. Yep. So I think engagement, good idea, good try. Lasted a long time, was hopeful. It's ended, it's gone, it's over. And we don't know what to replace it with.
Although China's core political structure has remained largely unchanged, Chinese society itself has transformed dramatically over the past 40 years. How would you evaluate these changes without U.S. engagement? What kind of society do you think China would have today? And moving forward, how would China pursue internal transformation?
Well, interestingly, when I first went to China and the Cultural Revolution was going on.
1974.
Yes, you couldn't imagine anything else. That seemed to be China.
That's true.
The Cultural Revolution. Mao Zedong, Mao Zedong thought. And yet, when he died in 1976, what happened the next year then? Or actually when Zhou Enlai died first in 1976, Tiananmen Square flooded with hundreds of thousands of people protesting against the Cultural Revolution in Mao and the Gang of Four and Jiang Qing, Mao's wife. Couldn't imagine that when I was in China a year before. So I urge everybody to remember that underneath, it's like underground reservoirs in China, there are deep aquifers of sentiment that's very different from Mao Zedong, from Xi Jinping, and much of that sentiment, those political views, that experience happened during the 1980s and 90s. And it's still there. And it will come back. But it will take a different kind of leadership to allow it to come back. But China has a very deep tradition in the 20th century of a much more open, from the May 4th movement in 1919 on down. Even Chiang Kai-shek, Chiang Kai-shek, his government, it wasn't perfect and it was corrupt and had a lot of problems, but it was a republic.
That's the first republic.
It was the first republic, and its principles were not bad. However, it got really disrupted by the Japanese invasion.
That's true.
And by the conflict with the Chinese Communist Party. So there are traditions within China which I think we will see express themselves again at some point. When, we don't know. But nothing is forever. Trump is not forever. Xi Jinping is not forever. What will come next, we don't know. But I think we have to look at the historical experiences to understand that, China has so many brilliant, good people who are intelligent, who want something different. And it's not everybody, but it's a lot of people. And there will come a time when their voices will be heard, I think, in a different way. Just as we couldn't imagine it during the Cultural Revolution that things could change, it's very hard now to imagine what comes after Xi Jinping. But something will come after it, and it may surprise us.
That's very interesting because you mentioned a different tradition, which is a republic tradition.
Yes.
Which is kind of ignored by a lot of people.
Most people think Chiang Kai-shek was corrupt, an autocrat. But actually, if you go back and you look at the late 1920s, 1930s, the Nanjing government, he was making a lot of progress.
That's right.
And basically the fundamental idea of a Republican government was a good one. And it wasn't perfect, but it was more or less working. And who destroyed it? Japan. So Japan gave birth to the Chinese Communist Party and the People's Republic of China, because it allowed them to sort of regroup in Shanxi and ultimately to kick Chiang Kai-shek out and take over. But that tradition exists. And remember, in the Republican period, what's so interesting about it, it was largely born in like Shanghai. And Shanghai, yes, it was a quasi-colony, but it was very open.
That's true.
Had newspapers, publications, had some of the great universities in Shanghai and China. Some of them founded by missionaries, but they're still great universities, very open, very humanistic. And a whole generation of people grew up. Many of them were Christian. And Chiang Kai-shek was Christian.
His whole family.
His whole family was Christian. I don't want to say Christians are good and Buddhists are bad or anything, but simply to say they were tolerant.
The leader to be.
The leader, and Chiang Kai-shek was also deeply Confucian. He meditated and he studied Confucius, but he also read the Bible. And many of his other ministers were also people who spoke foreign languages, who felt comfortable abroad. Now, does Xi Jinping feel comfortable abroad? No. He can't speak a foreign language. I think he feels clumsy. He's off at some G20 meeting and everybody's speaking German, French, English, and he can't. And he has his victim culture. I think he nurses a lot of grudges. And I think he also derives a lot of power out of keeping grudges, particularly against Japan. Yes, Japan did a monstrous thing during the Second World War. It was brutal beyond description in China. But that was almost 100 years ago. And sometimes you have to let go of history. Don't forget it, but let go.
Let go.
I mean, look at Germany. It changed. And I think if China wants to be a success, it can't be a victim. It can't cling to its victim culture. So this is a real problem. There are many contradictions that Xi Jinping, I think, has not been able to resolve. And he has a very limited notion of what greatness is. And it involves, I think, that great expression in Chinese, fuqiang, wealth and power.
Yes.
But there are other dimensions of a society that are absolutely critical, like humanism.
Right.
Just be nice. Don't lock people in prison. Don't execute them. Don't bully them. Don't restrain them. And this is the part of China's greatness which it hasn't accomplished.
There's a concept from some people think from Christian society. Some people think it's kind of also from the Renaissance, Enlightenment, all this kind of human progress.
I mean, I do think the Enlightenment was a fairly positive movement in Europe. Why? Because it depended on reason, not on belief, not on, prejudice, not on something else. And it was humanistic. In other words, just try to be nice to people.
Human-centered. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And, of course, that's a Christian message, too. But, all religions have a good side.
Mm-hmm.
They also have a bad side. But the real question is, I think, tolerance. And I think
spurs
all
from.
countries have trouble with tolerance. The United States is having trouble with it now. And China's had a terrible time with tolerance, tolerating people who you don't agree with. And the tradition of a one-party state is, you don't agree with me? Off to the Gulag in Russia, off to Laogai in China. And it's I don't know. I don't want to live that way. Finally, we come down to that question. How do we want to live? Under what kind of a government? What kind of a system? What kind of an ethic?
Society. Yeah.
And this is where I think China's great rejuvenation needs some new elements.
And so you're among the earliest American journalists to engage with China. We're talking about your earlier experience in 1974. Could you describe your first impression and how they compare with your views today? How has your personal experience shaped or reshaped your assessment of China, positively or negatively?
Well, when I went to China, actually it was early 1975. I had spent 2 years in Taiwan. And I thought I understood a little bit about Chinese society, spoke some Chinese. I'd had a Chinese girlfriend in Taiwan, and I felt comfortable there. And I had a very enjoyable time while there. So when I went to China, I had the expectation, I'd always wanted to go. I remember when I was in Taiwan, just feeling I was sort of on the sidelines of this extraordinary experiment that was happening in China with these hundreds of millions of people, and I wanted to go there, but I couldn't. So I spent 10 years just around the edges. Mm-hmm. So when I finally went there, it was with immense excitement and anticipation. But I found I was completely shut out, completely unabsorbable. I spent 2 months there.
Where is the place?
Well, I worked for a month in Dazhai.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was the model agricultural brigade in a very poor part of China. And then I spent a month working in the Shanghai electrical machinery factory.
Oh, wow. Well, it's a different world.
But it was during the Cultural Revolution where Chinese were not allowed to interact spontaneously and freely with foreigners. They were scared. They kept their distance. And whenever I would make an effort to reach out, I'd be pushed back.
Oh, they're afraid.
Yes. Everybody was afraid. Our party guides, leaders were afraid. The people were afraid. So it was very stylized, very kind of, propagandized sort of a tour. And if I, for instance, would walk over to the next village after working in Dazhai, they'd immediately come and get me and bring me back. They didn't want anybody to do anything
without their escort.
Without an escort, without a plan. So I came out of China very confused. What's going on? Something's not right here. But I didn't quite know what. Wanted to be friendly, wanted to be appreciative.
Yeah.
They'd invited me for 2 months. They'd paid for the whole trip.
You're so excited.
But I found myself constantly getting in trouble. And at one point, even basically being locked up in my cave. We lived in these caves in Shanxi. And being told, you're sick, you can't go out. Because I had been trying to talk with some people and do things alone with them and just hear what their views were, but that was not acceptable. So that was my experience. And but then, of course, I married a Chinese woman. And that just transformed my whole sort of ability to this was in the 1980s. to see China in a different way, and to understand things that were hard for me to understand before about what had happened to everybody, why people were the way they were, and just how brutal the Cultural Revolution had been, breaking up families, people being executed, people being accused of things that were totally ridiculous, being a rightist, being a leftist, being a counter-revolutionary, a bourgeois element, a capitalist rotor. I mean, good God. It was insane. But it all grew out of what we were talking about earlier, the pathology, I think, of Mao Zedong's growing up. And he was the big leader, and he got to say what had to be done, and it got done. Somehow, China does produce a lot of sycophants and a lot of ass kissers and a lot of bad people, but also produce a lot of wonderful people.
Totally agree. Why has West, especially the U.S., misjudged China? Would you acknowledge any misjudgments of your own? Within the American intellectual community, is there a sense of frustration or even anger about feeling misled by China? What is dominant attitude among U.S. scholars toward China today?
As I said earlier, it's always very difficult for me to, during the different periods of my life, to know exactly whether I was seeing things clearly and correctly or not. But over the years, I think you begin to gain more and more and more experience, and you understand that life is complicated.
Right. Yeah.
And I think it's become clearer and clearer to me that, the Chinese Communist Revolution under Mao Zedong was really an incredibly traumatic and destructive experience for China. I was interested in it initially because I wanted to see if it worked. Could you create a new man? Could you create people to, with a different way of thinking about things, more collectively inclined, less selfish, which is, of course, the root of capitalism. Mm-hmm. And I think finally, after many, many years of looking at things, I realized that human beings have a fundamental nature. And it's very difficult to change it. You can put them in thought reform, you can put them in prison, you can separate their families, you can punish them, you can even execute people, but it doesn't change fundamental human nature, which is people want to have a good life, they want to get married, they love their kids, they want to take care of their friends. You can't reorganize those basic human instincts. So that took me a while to kind of figure out, to see this revolution isn't working. Not in this regard. It could work in some other ways. It could build dams, it could do things like that. But so I think that the part that even now in China that they don't quite appreciate is that it isn't just Chinese culture and Western culture, but there is some fundamental way that human beings are that needs to be respected. And people need to be allowed to have a certain amount of individualism, and they need to be left to have their lives, lead their lives as they choose to lead them. And, of course, that was not something that the Chinese Communist Revolution could allow. You couldn't have your religion. You couldn't listen to music they didn't like. You couldn't read books they didn't like. You couldn't marry someone they didn't like. It was complete control of life in this effort to create the new man. And it didn't work. It still hasn't worked. Some people will shut up, but they don't necessarily become transformed.
And so long experiment.
Yes, it's a long experiment. And I think it's sometimes hard for young people to, this is where experience, I think, matters. The more you see, the more you experience, the more you understand. And you understand it's very complicated, filled with ambiguities. And there's no kind of absolute right and wrong. And this is where I think Mao Zedong and the revolution, and to a certain degree Xi Jinping, they think there's an absolute right and an absolute wrong. And if you don't choose their right, you're wrong. And it's difficult.
I really like, how you describe this kind of, how you understand eventually, kind of what's going on in China, this whole development.
The bitter reality of all of our lives is we have to live in ambiguity.
Right.
And there is no perfect revolution, no perfect way to do anything. There's better ways. And I think the problem with Stalin and Mao and Kim Il-sung and those guys was they didn't appreciate ambiguity. They thought, this is the way we're going to do it. This is what Marx and Lenin said. This is what we think. You do it this way or you're finished. That is a violation of, I think, the fundamental nature of what human beings are. And it's all a bit of a mystery, I have to say. So no one quite knows what the right answer is. But I think we can see pretty clearly what the wrong answers were. I mean, Hitler was the wrong answer. And what happened? Not until the 1970s when Willy Brandt, who was then the chancellor, went to Poland, and he went to the Warsaw Ghetto where all the Jews were sequestered during the war and many killed. And he went to the memorial, and he was supposed to lay some flowers down. And instead, he fell to his knee, and he apologized.
That's a great gesture.
It was I think, probably the gesture of gestures that signaled to the world that Germans had overcome that terrible period in their history under Hitler. Can you imagine Xi Jinping doing that? I mean, making such a gesture, I could imagine it, but I don't think it'll happen, where he says goes to some cultural revolutionary shrine and say, this was a mistake. This was a nightmare. And we have to recognize this, or we can't be a healthy society.
If we do it, do you think the world, the society in China, the whole world will see it differently?
I think if Xi Jinping could make a gesture like that, he could be the king of the universe. I think people would have such respect for it. Because China has accomplished so much. What it has not accomplished is to become a more humanistic society that can recognize its failures and its faults. That is the highest challenge for any leader. And if he could do that, he would have earned the respect of the world instantly.
That's a big picture.
Yeah.
Beautiful picture.
People do monstrous things to each other.
That's
They
right.
always have. And mostly there's no apologies. I mean, no one's apologized for what Stalin did in Russia, all the people that ended up in the labor camps. And what a nightmare. I mean, Gorbachev made some gestures,
Right.
but not Putin.
Nothing. Thank you for portraying this beautiful picture.
I'm not
The
sure it's a
bright
beautiful
line,
picture.
The bright light on the horizon. If leaders can do that.
Yes, leadership is everything, isn't it?
Yeah.
And now the world has no great leaders that I can see. I mean, where's the Churchill? Where is the Adenauer? Where is the Franklin Delano Roosevelt?
That's true.
Where is the Eisenhower? Where is the, what's his name in South Africa? Mandela.
Mandela.
You know, there's some amazing leaders that we've had, historically speaking. But we don't have any now.
We have to wait.
We have to wait. In the meanwhile, we enter dangerous waters.
If we don't have a great leader come out.
You know, it means that leaders who are not great tend to act very capriciously and very unpredictably, and can very easily get us into trouble, as
That's
Putin
true.
did in the Ukraine. Why did he attack the Ukraine and have a war that's gone on for 3 years with hundreds of thousands of people wounded and killed and bombing apartment buildings? Why? Why did he do it? There's no answer in logic. It's because he felt his empire had been dismembered. He'd been disrespected. He felt not great enough. And this is the danger of all leaders. This is why we need to read Shakespeare, because Shakespeare understood what a tyrant was. He understood the psychological nature of it, where it comes from, and how dangerous and damaging it can be. I don't know what the answer is to that, but we've had leaders throughout history who have been complete monsters, and we've had some wonderful leaders. But I think we're entering a period now where we're losing our sense of a truly humane, moral, but strong, effective, a leader that earns people's respect. Certainly not Donald Trump. Certainly not Xi Jinping, Putin, Kim Jong-un, Orban, Lukashenko in Belarus. No. These people we're familiar with from before. Throughout history, there have been people like this, and none of them have ended well. You asked about Kishore Mahbubani.
Oh, yeah.
Kishore Mahbubani is an Indian Singaporean, was in the foreign ministry. You know, I think his view is China's strong, China's powerful. We have to recognize them. We have to get along. And America's sort of old-fashioned breaking down, and the future is China. I did an event with him.
The future is Asia. You think?
It may be Asia. Good.
Yeah.
I'm comfortable with that. But Asia has a lot of countries.
Right.
It doesn't mean just China. It means they've got to get along in a way, because the future is not Asia's if there is war.
Right.
That'll be catastrophe. So Mahbubani's idea, I think he thinks, well, China's strong trade partner, and the U.S. is too full of itself. And under Trump, I more or less agree with him. But, you know, China's not the answer. China's not a viable proposition in the long run, because there are too many contradictions, and too much of it is dependent on one man. And that one man cannot even appoint a successor, a Jiebanren, because as soon as he does, he knows he's finished. He's a lame duck. So the system has a very difficult time functioning. So these guys are there until they die, and then something happens, and there's no system there's no way to have sort of order during times of crisis or death of a leader or whatever. So I think it's not despite all of its successes, it's not a model that if I was Kishore Mahbubani, I would want to follow. I'd be careful with it. I wouldn't antagonize it. I might even trade with China. But I wouldn't think that it's just apples and oranges. And here we get down to political systems, and I'm sorry to say, I don't think it's ideological to say that democracy, despite its imperfections, is a more humane, successful, better political system than autocracy. That's just my view.
More civilized. If you want to see the pandemic, what happened?
Yes, I think it is more civilized. I remember going around China and little red signs on people's houses saying, you know, 文明之家, a civilized household, and thinking, oh, well, that's nice. But what does it mean?
That's true. What does it mean? If you think about the pandemic.
I don't know. I think it doesn't mean to me what a civilized house ought to be. It just means they put it up to...
Explain a little bit how you see what's a civilized kind of society.
Well, listen, I you know, it's a difficult time to be an American and to speak the way I do because people might think I'm saying that America is the answer. I am painfully aware that America is not the answer. America is fallible and weak and broken, just like many other countries in history. It had some good times. Right now is not one of them. That doesn't mean that the principles of tolerance, justice, humaneness, goodness, all these things are wrong. It just means America is no longer the model that sometimes people thought it was. But it was always ambiguous. It was always half and half. It was never perfect. But it wasn't bad. And now we don't have many models for people to follow, either models as leaders or models of countries that we look to and say, I mean, Canada, Australia, we can say, gee, that's not bad. Mm-hmm. They get along pretty well. Right. And even Great Britain, you know, they were a great power, and they didn't have a Thucydides trap. When they collapsed, there was no war. So, yeah, there's some okay places, good places to turn to, but by and large, we are in a very dangerous predicament right now because people like Kishore Mahbubani, in effect, are challenging. They're leaning in favor of autocracy, right, and not sort of trying to champion the idea of a republic or a democratic society as much as I think they ought to be. If he wants to go live in China, go. Be there. See how you like it.
He lives in Singapore.
He lives in Singapore, which is a pretty good place to live.
Right. I agree.
So that would be my disagreement with someone like him, that I think we are at a moment when all of us are going to have to make some choices. What do we believe in? And what leaders do we think are good leaders? Not just ambitious leaders. Shakespeare, Sophocles, Euripides, they wrote play after play after play after these men that had big ambitions. That's what hubris is, and excessive ambition. And what happened to them? Every single one of them failed. So that's not the answer. And that's what this idea about finding greatness and restoring your country to greatness, I understand that. It's fine to be, but don't be a great country, be a good country. And what's wrong with getting along? Why do we need a whole new army in China? Who's the enemy? Japan? Korea? Philippines? The United States? Vietnam? I don't know. What's going on here? Why?
It's very dangerous.
Very dangerous. And wastes resources.
Yeah, wastes resources, right. Yeah.
I mean, who's Russia's enemy? Nobody wants to attack Russia.
Oh, Russia think, or quite some people think NATO want to.
No. I don't think Putin does think NATO will attack Russia. What he thinks is NATO will prevent him from restoring his empire. And I hope it does. But no, nobody's going to attack Russia. Who's going to attack China? Is there anybody talking about attacking China? No. People want to just get along. So what's the point of this big military? Maybe to defend the Chinese Communist Party?
Part of the Fujiang.
It's part of Fujiang, and yes, I know the party owns the People's Liberation Army. People's Liberation Army does not answer to the government; it answers to the party.
So, what factors brought U.S.-China relations to the current level of tension and confrontation? To what extent do you think Xi Jinping is responsible? Has Xi Jinping personally altered China's development trajectory? Do you think systematic reform in China is still possible? If so, what forces inside or outside the system might drive it? Yeah, the part.
Well, I think, Xi Jinping, I think, recognized that continued reform, even economic reform, but particularly political reform, would probably mean they would get to the point where it would start challenging the notion of a one-party system. So that's why reform came to an end. Deng Xiaoping had used it in a very utilitarian fashion. We need reform to get richer. But it reached a point where it became obvious, I think, to Xi Jinping that they were getting to the point where it would threaten the Chinese Communist Party, and so he cut it off. And that meant he had to cut off engagement too, because engagement relied on reform. If China wasn't reforming, what was the point of engaging? Because engagement's assumption was that it will encourage reform, both economic reforms, cultural reforms, political reforms, and that, it won't become maybe a republic or a democracy, but it will become something that we can live with, the whole world can live with, that the world could feel more comfortable with. So China has created a situation under Xi Jinping, paradoxically, where what Xi Jinping wants is not to make neighboring countries feel comfortable. He wants them to fear him. That's not a good dynamic to have in a neighborhood where you're trying to have global trade. You need people to feel relaxed and comfortable with their partners. So I think this is the great tragedy of the Asian dream, if you could describe it that way, that if China was the keystone of the arch, the biggest country, it was very important that it allowed other countries to feel safe and comfortable with it. It's done exactly the opposite. It's attacked Korea. When the THAAD missile systems went in, they cut off all the tourism. They closed all the latte chair stores in China. They punitively retaliated against Korea. They're doing it against Japan now. They're doing it against the Philippines. All of these ships trying to ram each other off Palawan and the South China Sea. And they're also doing it. This is this strange dance with Trump. I mean, it's hard to describe it even, but now we're at the point where what matters is choke points. What choke points does the U.S. have to choke China? Microchips, its market power. And what does China have? It has rare earths, critical minerals. It has solar panels, polysilicon. So we're at this stage where the two powers who should be collaborating and once were cooperating now are trying to figure out how to strangle each other, prevent each other from progressing, because we fundamentally view each other as a threat. And the whole object of engagement was to reduce that sense of threat. But that depended on China continuing to reform. It also depended on America continuing to have smart diplomats that would take risks and say, yes, they're communists. Yes, they're Marxist-Leninists. But let's try to diminish the difference between us so we can at least get along and survive without a war.
So what you described is the system or the order we had before.
I mean,
right now, a lot of people think this order should be teared down because, China is rising.
Mao Zedong said, 不破不立. Without destruction, there can be no construction. Maybe we do need to tear down this order. I don't know. It's not a very good order the way it's constructed now. Everybody very suspicious of everybody else and very hostile and retaliating, cutting things off. I just went to see the Hozewang, the Monkey King opera, the San Francisco Opera. It's quite about, the Xiyoji, the Journey to the West story. It's quite a wonderful opera. It was going to go to Shanghai. I just heard that Shanghai canceled it. Oh. Now, why? Well, I can probably give you some reasons. First of all, they probably didn't like the script. Second of all, they didn't like Americans monkeying around with the Monkey King. Second of all,
the Chinese monkey.
Chinese monkey. U.S.-China relations are terrible. But that's too bad. So bit by bit, the bridges are falling down.
Many observers believe China still possesses strong economic momentum and tech potential. Its industries appear to be advancing despite external pressure. Do you think this trend will continue?
I think it's undeniably true that China has been extraordinarily successful in many respects, particularly in manufacturing and creating an extraordinary supply chain system using robots, mechanizing, and even in sort of technological innovation. I think that there's a lot that needs to be respected about what China has succeeded in doing. That said, I think there are also parts of the economy that are very weak and that nobody quite knows what to do about because they don't dare to reform. Obviously, the housing market is one thing. The problem of demographics is a huge problem. Too many old people retiring, no young people coming up to take jobs, make money, pay for the pensions of the old people. And, I should say, no immigration. Now, one of America's great virtues, although it did get out of control, was that we welcomed foreigners, people like you and you. And it gave us immense strength. And it also irrigated our society in the younger levels with ambitious, talented, hardworking people. So the older people retired and someone would pay their pensions. And if you look on construction sites in America, you don't see any white guys like me working there. It's all Latin Americans with Chinese bosses. And immigrants have been a source of a huge part of America's sort of vigor, energy, strength, and ability to to advance. China doesn't have that. Why? Because they're suspicious about letting a lot of people in from the outside they don't know. They want to control. So that's a big problem. So I think, and then I think the whole political problem of succession and political system is a huge problem. I mean, how long can a one-party state go on in history, at least in modern history? They don't last that long. The Chinese Communist Party's done pretty well, but is it going to be there for eternity? I don't think so.
And the Chinese, they're definitely very proud of their, not really, kind of the economic not going very well right now, but the tech side, they're very proud of it.
Mm-hmm.
How
yes,
do
they
you
should
justify,
be proud.
Kind of the tech will bring up something or...
Yes, I mean, China, this is why I said earlier, China has so much to be proud of. Why not enjoy it?
Mm-hmm.
Why not? And why not let other people feel comfortable and praise you and participate in your success, be glad about your success? President Obama, I think, was the last president to say that. He said, we don't see China's rise against America's interest. But I don't think she believed it. But that's
the rhetoric.
Yeah. But I think in Obama's case, it was more than rhetoric. And that is what we should aspire to create, which is a situation on both sides, China and the U.S. We don't feel that the rise of the other side, the success of the other side is a threat to us. We don't feel Europe is a threat to us.
That's true.
We don't feel that Japan's a threat to us. I mean, we have disagreements. And that's the state we should try to be in with, get into with China. But instead, we're going in the opposite direction. More and more, China is being perceived by Americans as a threat.
True.
And I think China feels the same way. Why?
Do you think that's a very popular attitude right now in the American side and
Yes.
the Western side?
Yes, I do. I think more and more people are very distrustful of China. I mean, Trump is a different story because he just wants to make a deal. He'd make a deal with the devil. But I think if you gauge American political feelings, sentiment, generally speaking, in my lifetime, I've seen just a great collapse of trust in China and a rise of distrust and a sense of seeing China as a risk, if not a threat. And how could it be otherwise when there are ships ramming Philippine ships and Japanese ships and there are bombers flying around Taiwan and I mean, Taiwan is, do you remember what Mao Zedong said about Taiwan? He said this to Henry Kissinger. He said, Taiwan, he said, if we can solve it in 100 years, that's time enough. And when Deng Xiaoping went to Japan on his way in 1979 to see Jimmy Carter when they exchanged diplomatic recognition, he stopped there in Tokyo and he said, he was asked about Taiwan. He said, listen, let's leave that for future smarter generations to solve. So why doesn't Xi Jinping go on television tomorrow and say, ladies and gentlemen, I've been thinking. Taiwan, it's a difficult problem. And it's making a lot of people feel very uncomfortable. I want to say this. Taiwan is ours. Belongs to China. We don't renounce that right. But we believe that if we wait, eventually China will become more open, more, the kind of place that Taiwan wants to join as it did under Ma Ying-jeou. And then ultimately we'll solve it. But right now, no independence, Taiwan is ours, but let's not get everybody all stirred up and crazy about a possible war. So instead, Xi Jinping has said, by 2027, I want the PLA ready to attack.
I hope they can write down your words instead.
Well, that's why I'm saying them. I hope so too, but I won't hold my breath.
Or hold our breath too.
So actually, to finally answer your question, is the Chinese economy strong or weak? It's both.
Right, both.
It has very strong elements. It can be very, very impressive and creative. It also got some very deeply unreformed, dangerous places, which I don't think it's going to be able to easily.
What was in your mind of this reform?
Well, I think there are a lot of things that need reform.
Just name one or two.
Well, one is finance of local governments. They don't have a tax base that can support the needs of local governments. They've derived their funding by selling land, which I might say they confiscated from the owners in 1949 and nationalized. Now they're selling it back into the market to build buildings nobody wants to live in. And that subsidizes the local governments with sufficient funds to pay pensions, schools, health care, all of these various things, roads, That's not a viable funding model.
You have been critical of China's development model, yet China has achieved major progress in poverty reduction, social modernization, and global integration. Are these not significant accomplishments? Are the ideological or moral expectation placed on China's political system unrealistically high?
Well, I think China's political system has produced some very extraordinary accomplishments. You know them. Infrastructure, I think, raised standard of living. Cities have grown. Healthcare has improved, and people have become much more globalized. And yes, there are a lot of extraordinary things that it's accomplished. But I think some of it, is due to the party's policies, that they can be consistent. They have 5-year plans. They're not like Americans. One president leaves and everything changes. Yes, there are some benefits to having a centralized authoritarian regime with leaders that stay a long time. And I acknowledge those. And I think it's a pity America and other European countries can't find a way to be more consistent. But I think that the dangers of that are also extraordinarily large. And I think, you finally have to ask yourself, what is life about? Is it just about being able to ride on high-speed trains and living in a high-rise and being able to go to the shopping mall? I understand these things are important, that for people to have good lives and be fed and clothes and whatnot. But there are other aspects of life, too.
Such as?
Well, I think people, culture, religion, people don't live by bread alone. So I think some of these things, what you get to read, movies you get to see. For many people, religion is extremely important. Who you can marry, All of these things are now you can marry anyone you want, but that wasn't true for 30 years. So I think you have to ask yourself, what is still missing in this success story, which does have some clear and obvious successes that should be noted and esteemed. And I think this is where you get into things that are less tangible, less concrete, and they, in my view, do center around the question of freedom and liberty. That I fundamentally believe human beings, our lives are short, but their lives are most fulfilled if you have, some real measure of liberty and freedom. There's no perfect answer, but I don't think the kinds of controls and punishments for people who don't obey the political dictates of the state, I don't think that engenders a good life. And I think this is where China's incomplete.
That's very interesting. Why a lot of Chinese complain about it? They're not saying this needs?
My friends, the people I talk to, they're not saying it in public. You don't read it in the People's Daily, but they're saying it. Now, this isn't everybody, but I think educated people, professional people, people in urban classes, people who maybe peasants don't think this way, rural people, or just an ordinary worker doesn't think too much about this, but still, if you look back in history at human civilizations, the great works have come from these kinds of expressions. Whether it's literature, art, music, philosophy, science, religion. We forget that Jesus Christ was a rebel. He was a Jew, king of the Jews, he declared himself, under Roman occupation. And he was both attacking the Jews and the Romans. And what happened? He got crucified. So that's kind of what happens in China now. If you have someone like figuratively speaking, someone who steps out with a different idea, he doesn't want to militarily overthrow anybody or whatever, that person gets put up on a cross. And I think that's not healthy. That's not civilized.
So you're more criticized on how to bring people's life more full.
Yes. I mean, isn't that the point of being alive?
Yeah.
I mean, is the point of being alive to be a 知识青年 and sent up to Heilongjiang?
It looks like we used to kind of have this kind of a full life, like the character you created in your book, The Old Home.
Yeah, well, as you recall, the book I wrote in English, and it's in Chinese actually, the Taiwan edition, My Old Home is Guxiang. That's Lu Xun's great short story, Guxiang. And I turned to fiction, even though I've written, I don't know how many books, 15, 20, I can't even remember, but they're all nonfiction. But this one took me 35 years. And I wrote it because I thought you cannot understand China if you can't understand some of these other elements that don't have to do with economics, reform, Xi Jinping's statements and speeches and policy and international relations, that there are other things that tell you more about what goes on in China, like music, religion, how people get along with each other, husbands and wives, parents and children. And these things are very hard to write about in nonfiction. So I thought, okay, let me try. So I decided to do this book about a musician, a classical musician who studies in San Francisco, Chinese, goes back in 1949 to build a new China. And it's about his son and what happens to the family. And he loves Bach and he's religious. So he does not have a good time. And it's just to say, apropos of what we were talking about, what is life about?
Yeah, why?
What is a meaningful life?
A man have passion, have belief, you know, his religion belief.
Why do they love certain works of literature? Why do people fall in love with someone? Why do they like their kids, love their kids? Why do they think art? I mean, Chinese art, landscapes, beautiful, gorgeous. Why does that mean something to them? If I had to say it, someone like Donald Trump has about this big a piece of life, which is business and deals. But life is this big.
That's
and I think Xi Jinping maybe has this big a piece. You know, I don't know what goes on in his private world, but I think, you hear the Pope talk. It's very interesting. And here's a man who lives in a different world, a world of spiritual belief. Seems like a very decent man.
He is.
And I don't get that sense about political leaders, very many of them. Certainly not Putin, certainly not Xi, certainly not Trump, maybe not Modi. You know, they're just kind of tough political creatures. Certainly not Mao Zedong. I mean, Mao Zedong was a really interesting man and not a stupid man. He wrote some interesting things.
Right,
but he was a damaged human being. This is why I read Shakespeare, because Shakespeare wrote about damaged human beings who end up as leaders. King Lear, Macbeth, Hamlet, Coriolanus. They're all great in their way, but broken in some other way.
That's something really inspiring for me to read.
Well,
yeah, because we're talking about the human level.
Well, I mean, listen, aren't we human?
We're human, but...
Yes. And isn't Xi Jinping human? Last I knew, he was. But I've been on 2 trips with him, and I'm going back to China when Trump goes. I'm going to go on that trip. And, you know, Xi Jinping doesn't show much of anything. You look at him. He doesn't reveal what's going on inside. I mean, I've read all his speeches, and incredibly, some of them are, they're not that interesting, but I learned something.
What you learned?
Well, I learned what his committee wrote, but I don't learn much about him as a person.
That's true.
And who is he? You know? Now, he may be somebody quite interesting that we just don't know about. Trump's another story. I think Trump is a bit, Trump is a really damaged human being. The last person on earth you'd want to have leading a country. But so was Hitler.
Yeah.
So was Mussolini. So was Stalin. So was Mao. All damaged people.
That's very interesting.
So this is why we turn to literature, because literature is all about people who you want to understand why they do what they do.
If U.S.-China relations continue to their present course, what trajectory do you foresee could open conflict or a proxy conflict become possible? What might be the end game look like? Are we headed towards a Soviet Union-style long-term rivalry?
I think for now, probably we're in a state of not only rivalry, but where we're trying to checkmate each other through these different choke points to limit not only the ability of one country to, dump stuff in trade in another country, but actually military kind of checkmate and various other financial checkmates. So I think this is where we're headed. Where it ends up, I don't know. But what's sad about it is that for a while during engagement, we had managed to agree that if our political systems were different, we could still try to find other areas to collaborate and cooperate and not threaten each other. But now we are back to threatening each other. And so I think the future really depends on whether we have military conflict of some kind. If we can avoid that in Asia, that is the primary goal. But we see everybody arming up.
Yeah.
Japan is arming.
Right.
Korea is arming up.
That's
China's massively arming up.
Europe is also arming
And Europe
them up.
is arming up. So this is a bad sign because it means everybody feels threatened. But why should Russia want to threaten Europe? Those are the questions diplomats can't answer. Yes, because they're afraid if NATO gets into the Ukraine joins NATO, then what? Well, nothing. Ukraine's not going to attack Russia. Right. NATO's not going to attack Russia. And the same with the alliance structure in Asia. This is a defensive structure. It's not an offensive structure. But here Taiwan is like a big blinking red light because now Japan has said, Sanai Takaichi, the new prime minister, has said that this is an existential threat if China attacks Taiwan because, the islands, the southernmost islands of Japan, Yonaguni and Miyako, are like 60 miles off the coast of Taiwan. And all of Japan's sea lanes go right by Taiwan. So it wasn't a provocative statement. It was just a realistic statement that she said. And what did Japan do? China do? They started boycotting Japan, punishing Japan. So this is a very childish and dangerous dynamic to get going where everybody wants to punish everybody else instead of collaborating. And this is happening right at a time where the global economy is all intertwined, so it's very difficult to pull apart, separate the supply chains. And but we know what happens when war breaks out. When war broke out in the Ukraine, every foreign business in Russia lost everything.
Right.
And if it happens in Asia, my God.
So this interdependence is not there. And some people might say Russia is a different case because, well, we still...
It's different in that it's smaller and there was less at stake economically.
Yeah.
But still a lot at stake.
A lot of stake.
But in Asia, everybody's connected to everybody, and China is the center. So if there is some sort of military conflict, the whole puzzle gets thrown on the floor and breaks apart.
Do you think it's possible?
Yeah.
People will not consider their dependence
I think it's,
on each other?
again, I'm a historian, and I look at history. People didn't think it was possible that someone like Hitler would succeed. He was a kind of a deranged, crazy guy. He's sort of nuts. But he succeeded. And he threw all of Europe into chaos. and Mussolini. I mean, there are other cases. This is not unusual. And so I think it's not impossible. I hope Xi Jinping, I don't know who he listens to. I don't know if he'll listen to this podcast.
I hope so.
But I think he's a very smart man, I think, in certain ways. I don't know who he seeks counsel from. But I wish he would invite some people in who disagree with him and just quietly listen to what they have to say. If he was a really great leader, that's what he'd do.
Let's crossing our fingers. As a former dean of UC Berkeley's Graduate School of Journalism, how do you view the challenge facing media amid this high politicized narrative struggle between U.S. and China? Are there media organizations at risk of being drawn into ideological polarization? Mm-hmm. Is true objectivity still achievable?
Well, listen, the media is important in two ways. And one way is in an authoritarian society, and the other way is in a democratic society. In a democratic society, the role of the media is to be free and clear of the government, to be honest, fair, but to research, to investigate, and to serve as a check and balance on power. In an authoritarian society, that is not the role of the media. The role of the media is to be propaganda, to serve the state. The media is not separate from the state. It's not designed to challenge and check the state. It is designed to support the state and to serve as a mouthpiece for the state. That's what propaganda is. So in both cases, it's exceedingly important. And China did have a period in the 80s and 90s when the media opened up. It was quite extraordinary. I was just stunned. I was there practically, all during those years. And just to see the way publishing opened up, translations from abroad, the Baogao Wenxue, the all kinds of different sorts of investigative reporting flourished. And that's over. Films, documentary films, magazines, newspapers, now social media. So I think this is a really important area, and I think in America, the media has become extremely commercialized and trivialized. Influencers and all this, whatever it is. There are still some great media outlets. The Financial Times, New York Times, Washington Post, but most people don't read them. So most people are uninformed. Even in a free society, they don't care to be informed. In China, many people would like to be informed, but they can't get access to information that's not state-controlled. So it's difficult for them. So I think this is a really important area that we need to pay a lot more attention to, particularly in America, where the media is one of the last outside independent checks and balances on the sort of the really very dangerous tendencies that we see coming out of Washington.
Yeah, I think that right now this kind of the new media comes out. It's kind of very concerned, not only in the United States, also in Europe as well.
Yes.
All this kind of free society or open society.
Well, I'm glad it's there, and I'm glad the United States and democracies still have civil society, still have open media, still have churches, still have universities, still have think tanks that are not
all these institutions.
Yes, that are independent of the government. Mm-hmm. China does not have those. And I think it suffers because of it. There's a kind of a blindness that can happen. I think, again, it's this blindness that again and again and again we see leading to catastrophes in history.
Such as which?
You know, there's an expression in English, rich as Croesus. Croesus was a king back in the sort of the early Greek period of the state of Lydia. And he was fabulously wealthy and powerful. And he went to this oracle, the Oracle of Delphi, which you go to consult to see what their predictions will be. And he said to the Oracle of Delphi, what would happen? He wanted to, I think it was Persia, he wanted to attack Persia, sort of like China wanting to attack Taiwan. And he said, what would happen? And the Oracle of Delphi said, if you attack, you will lose your kingdom, you will lose your wealth, and you will lose your power. So what did King Croesus do? He attacked. And what happened? He lost everything. So I look at that, again, Greek mythology, Greek tragedies, all of these things are very interesting to read and think about Putin, Xi, and Donald Trump, because you see these ancient people completely understood this, that leaders, they get all drunk on power, rejuvenation, greatness, and they want to go attack somebody, and they lose everything. So I sometimes worry that China's immense success, and I've lived through it, watching it happen,
and that's
could be put at
years.
risk, and
right.
China could turn into a tragedy. I remember when I was in Taiwan, this was 1960, I don't know, 1 or 2, way back. And I used to go down to the Zongtongfu, the presidential palace, because Chiang Kai-shek asked me to come to tea.
Oh, wow.
I ride my bicycle down, go in and go up, and I mean, he was very hard to understand because he had this Ningbo accent. But I remember thinking, what a tragedy. This is not a bad man. Yes, he had some autocratic tendencies, but he was basically struggling to be a good person at the same time. And you read this in his diaries.
Yeah.
And here he is, sitting on Taiwan all alone, lost his country.
Chat with you.
I don't remember what we spoke about, but it was, I have some pictures of him and me sitting there together. But it's just a reminder that leaders make mistakes, and the costs are high, not only for them, but for tens of millions of people.
That's true.
And we're victims of their decision-making. And I fear some bad decisions are being made right now, both in Europe and Asia.
Now, it looks like the ordinary people very easily becomes the victims of this.
Well, yes, I mean, people have been victims for thousands of years, right?
That's true. Mm-hmm.
I mean, we've had nothing but war since the beginning of history. We thought we maybe came to the end of a period after the Second World War where that was the war to end all wars. And maybe common sense would prevail and we'd prevent a big war. And we did.
We did. We have the Pan-Americana.
But right now, we're failing.
So what's your suggest for the ordinary people, caught in this conflict? Like, what attitude should ordinary Chinese citizens adapt, given that they cannot directly influence the political system or the broader international environment? If you're to offer advice, what mindsets or action would you encourage?
That's a very tough question of what one would, as an outsider, advise Chinese to do. One thing I should say is, of course, a lot of Chinese are leaving. Big communities forming in places like Japan and Singapore and Europe, America. So there's a lot of people deciding, I don't want to be here now. I think the people who are staying there in China, I would just say there's a limited amount that you can do without getting yourself in deep trouble. And some people were willing to do that. But, I've just been reading this book on Lin Zhao. You know her?
Yeah.
So you remember Lin Zhao went to a Christian school in Suzhou. She was a young woman, went to Peking University, studied literature. She was Christian, but when 1950, she became deeply committed to the communist revolution. But then she got disillusioned and she began criticizing. Anyway, to make a long story short, they put her in prison, but she would not stop writing. And they took away her pen, so she started writing with blood from her little finger. She wrote like 100,000-word letter to the People's Daily. Anyway, finally, she was in jail for quite a while. They executed her and sent the bullet to her family and charged them 5 cents for it, as the tradition is. Her stuff survived. And a judge, after Deng Xiaoping came to power, said that the jail had to return her written things to her parents, her family. And they got it out to Stanford Library. So there was one person who defied the party. Brilliant. Her poetry is beautiful. Her writing is elegant, clear, smart. And what happened? She got executed. So you can't ask Chinese people to go that route. A few will, but not many. So what's the alternative? Read. Teach your children well. Keep your friends. And wait. And if you see something you can do in the meanwhile, do it. I mean, we had the white paper revolution during the pandemic, There's a lot of very brave Chinese you never hear about. I mean, look at Liu Xiaobo, died in prison. How many tens of thousands of people have died in prison?
Without leaving anything, right?
Yeah. So I don't know what the answer is. The people who oppose the party, and I've known a lot of them, they too kind of get broken, because to be in opposition is so hard.
That's true.
And you get attacked, you get imprisoned, you get dehumanized. So it's a really difficult question, and I don't think as an outsider I have any right to tell people in China what to do about it. My hands full here in America trying to figure out what to do about our situation. But I'm stuck with China. I've spent my whole life doing China, so I do think about it, and reading, writing.
Thank you so much. That's a wonderful conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Well, thank you. I did too.
Thank you.